So in my research for the James Cameron Spider-Man film, I was able to find 2 script treatments of James Cameron's Spider-Man. One of them obviously carrying over from the original Golan and Globus plans for Spider-Man. It includes Professor Ock, Wiener, and the Waldos. And then another treatment, which is obviously James Cameron's own treatment, which features a completely different storyline and different villains altogether. I will be posting links to this in the description, as well as the storyboards, so that you can read them for yourself and really just, you know, you can get the full picture of what this Spider-Man film would have been like. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Having read through them myself, I would say that this was a fascinating read. In many ways, reading through the storyboards is almost like reading a graphic novel, and it's very kind of similar to the Ditko era in his art style. Spider-Man and Sandman all look correct to what they're supposed to be. Peter Parker looks just as he did in the Ditko era with the big round glasses and the sweater vest. Same goes for Aunt May. Honestly, it's not like looking through storyboards of films as you'd kind of expect, like a very unfinished treatment. You can kind of read this as a pretty much complete graphic novel. And there's a very clear distinction between the original Golan Globus version of Spider-Man being adapted by James Cameron, if you look at that script, and then go to James Cameron's own Spider-Man script. The Golan and Globus version of Spider-Man plays out like a 90s Spielberg cartoon. It's very sort of kooky, over the top, the names are all very silly. It's all definitely much more cartoonish than anything Spider-Man had ever been at that point, and definitely needed some work. I feel like this could have worked as an animated film directed by Steven Spielberg, but whether or not it would be good, I think a few revisions would make all the difference there. And then we have James Cameron's version, which is, like, it seems to pay a lot of tribute to classic Spider-Man. The dialogue, in many ways, especially towards the end, is very classic Spider-Man. You've got this narration from Peter Parker, who's often down on his luck, and it very much follows the same plot beats. You've got him getting bitten by the spider, the death of Uncle Ben, and then, of course, the birth of Spider-Man. And, of course, much more in line with the Steve Ditko Spider-Man comics, he kind of uses his powers initially to do talk shows, and he's not really interested in the superhero life. He then takes it on after the death of Uncle Ben. So that all sounds really good, right? Now, there are a couple of departures from the classic Ditko Spider-Man story here, which I believe served as kind of a blueprint for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, because in this case, Peter can shoot webs out of his wrists, but he wears web shooters to cover them up. So he's basically got these sort of like grotesque warts on his wrist, and he puts the web shooters over them to make them look more aesthetically pleasing, I guess, which also kind of explains how he shoots them through the costume. It's kind of like a nozzle. So if you like organic webs and you like the web shooters, then it's a win-win for you. But if the reason why you don't like the organic webs is because it's kind of gross, then this is even worse. Another similarity between this and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is that Mary Jane is the love interest from the get-go, and it even features a scene of him taking pictures of her for the New York paper, while at the laboratory where he would get bitten by the spider. Mary Jane kind of falls in love with Peter in this movie as well, as Peter and Mary Jane get assigned the same science project and they have to work together as partners. Peter Parker wants to learn more about his powers by studying the spiders, but Mary Jane doesn't really like that idea, but she's still attracted to Peter because of his personality. Thing is, much like in the Sam Raimi movie, Mary Jane Watson is dating Flash, but I think in this one it's a bit more of a serious relationship. So let's go a little more into the Spidey stuff. We do have a scene where Spider-Man accidentally kills a criminal. And as for Spidey's style of crime fighting, there is a scene where he apprehends a mugger, and once he's done that, he takes the money from them and gives it to a random family. In some ways turning Spider-Man into more of a Robin Hood sort of a character. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. I never thought of Spider-Man as being the kind of guy that deals with the financial side of crime fighting. At least he didn't take it for himself. I mean, the whole point of Spider-Man is that he doesn't do this stuff for a reward. Oh, but here is where things get very, very problematic. Mary Jane is being mugged, and Spider-Man comes to her rescue. This all sounds kind of familiar, right? And he swings across the Manhattan skyline with her in his arms, and they go to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, if you got some weird undertones from the upside down kiss in the Sam Raimi movies in the sort of modern context, this is on a new level. Spider-Man webs up Mary Jane, lifts up the bottom half of his mask, kisses her, and then, what's a family-friendly way of saying this? engage in the good pip pip the diddly do. And this is all sort of a culmination of the puberty storyline that's applied to this version of Spider-Man, as James Cameron was not very subtle with this at all. I mean, after that spider bite, we get a scene where Peter Parker wakes up with his webbing all over his legs. It was only a matter of time until Peter webbed up Mary Jane and, well, took his opportunities. This whole thing's about as romantic as the Rubber Man from American Horror Story, to be honest. There is, in at least today's context, something very problematic about a guy wearing a mask to win over a woman. And to go this far with it definitely wouldn't have aged well. And then once again, Mary Jane is depicted as a cheater. I don't really get this. The thing with Mary Jane in the comics is she's one of Peter Parker's most faithful girlfriends. Why's she gotta be so adulterous? Well, she has no regrets the next day and giddily breaks up with Flash Thompson. I guess that works anyway. I think the Peter and Mary Jane relationship in this film is probably one of the things that held the film back quite a bit. It's very, very adult, and James Cameron definitely went hard with the puberty metaphors. The film ends with Peter Parker and Mary Jane being together, now her knowing Peter's identity after a showdown with the two villains, who I'll talk about in a bit. And the whole irony is the Parker luck, they both end up getting accepted into two completely different colleges, with Mary Jane getting better grades than he does, but they see each other on weekends, so it's kind of a happy ending. Definitely ends on a much brighter and sparkier note than the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man 1 from 2002. So this film features two villains for Spider-Man to face off against. The first one is Electro, but he's not quite as you'd know him. Electro is more of this corporate kingpin, think Rupert Murdoch or Mr. Burns, who gets struck by lightning and gets lightning powers. Yep, it really is that simple. And he really wants to know where Spider-Man's power comes from, and he kind of keeps an eye on Spider-Man and becomes kind of obsessed, and of course it ends up with a battle between the two of them. Another major departure from Electro's classic character is his alter ego. He is not Max Dillon in this film, but instead Carlton Strand. Now, if you remember or have watched my reimagining Spider-Man villains Electro video, I mentioned that Electro's boss was named Carlton Strand. Yep, that was an homage. Thanks for paying attention and doing your research if you got that. I mean, you've kind of got some decent contrast between Peter and Strand as well, in that the whole thing with Peter is he uses his powers responsibly to be a hero, whereas Strand uses his powers very much to serve himself and is very risky with them. Strand uses his power to manipulate bank computers to transfer all of the balances over to his own to make him richer. I don't know how that works, but Strand also notices that there is a downside to his powers. He can no longer touch anybody, or else they will die from being electrocuted, which doesn't bode well for his, and I quote, beautiful assistant Cordelia. And the two, I guess it's implied that they are having regular rumpy-pumpy, shall we call it. So obviously, you know, if he touches her, she dies, and that's kind of a bit of a downer for him. But they find a way around it. She wears a wetsuit to bed now, but Carlton decides, no, he wants to play a little more risky. So he removes the protection, which is the wetsuit, by the way, if anyone's wondering, and goes ahead and kills her. But then he uses his electric powers to defibrillate her, so he's found a compromise. Now, I do wonder what the logistics of this are. Did he electrocute her, kill her, finish his business, and then defibrillate her? Because that's kind of dark. Selfish too. Strand, please your woman. So I guess Carlton Strand was trying to be ahead of the curve with the Sinister Six as he started trying to abduct other people with superhuman powers, all part of his power obsession basically. And one of the people he abducts is named Boyd. Boyd has the ability to control and turn into sand. He's Sandman, but with a new name Boyd for some reason. And he's kind of just the muscle for the job. Yeah, right. Get Boyd, Spider-Man. So I guess Spider-Man is still doing talk shows, but he's now kind of a figure of controversy after some of his web-slinging, wall-crawling antics didn't go to plan. And Boyd comes along to rough him up a bit. Meanwhile, Carlton Strand contacts J. Jonah Jameson to run a smear campaign against Spider-Man. And also, during his research on Spider-Man, Strand also uncovers Spider-Man's relationship with Mary Jane. So he kidnaps Mary Jane as bait for Spider-Man, with Strand threatening to electrocute Mary Jane, but while he does that, just to kind of tease Spider-Man a little bit, he gives her little static shocks all over her body. That's kind of disturbing. So Spider-Man then curses at them, declaring that he will kill them. I'm not gonna specify the word he says, because I don't want to get demonetized, but I guess maybe this was the inspiration for Spider-Man saying Mother Hubbard in The Amazing Spider-Man 1. So Spider-Man battles it out against Boyd and Carlton Strand, and the fight eventually leads to the World Trade Center, so yep, that would have aged well. So Strand tries to shoot a big beam of electricity at Spider-Man. Spider-Man dodges out of the way, instead it hits Boyd. Boyd turns to glass and dies. That's kind of odd to me. Boyd is just hired muscle. He's just doing his job. And he dies, with no kind of redemption or anything. No character. Boyd doesn't even have a character in this. So then Spider-Man and Carlton Strand's battle continues, with Strand eventually falling over the edge of the World Trade Center, but Spider-Man catches him. When Spider-Man catches him, he unmasks, and then Strand for some reason just coughs up blood and dies. Huh. So it was just a little bonk on the side of the World Trade Center that did it? Gosh, that quote sounds awful out of context. So, I don't know how this happens, but basically, Spider-Man takes $200 million in cash of Strand's money and dumps it into the streets of New York for everyone to take a little piece of. Very sort of mid-90s ending, that. Hooray for capitalism. So was Strand just carrying a big bag of money with him the whole time? What about Strand's descendants? Did they do anything wrong? Did they maybe deserve this money? There's a lot of potentially decent people that are out of jobs now. Spider-Man really is a menace in this film. But then again, I don't think you're supposed to think about it that much. Spider-Man just reappropriating money is not something he's really ever done, but I mean, it could be worse. What a cheesy ending. Spider-Man dumping money all over New York City, pretty unfazed by the 2 deaths he's seen there. Unmasking to Mary Jane, who asks no questions at all and just falls in love with him. And then the 2 graduate to different colleges. Wouldn't you know it? So why does this film not exist in that case? Well, there was quite a legal dispute regarding this film, as the legal rights were now kind of torn in half over the 2 sides of Golan and Globus, with them both wanting to work on Spider-Man films after the companies split. And then Marvel were obviously like, hang on a minute, that wasn't part of the deal. And then Viacom came in and was like, okay guys, break it up, break it up. Nobody makes a Spider-Man movie. That's literally the most interesting way I can really explain the corporate politics that went on there. I'm not gonna go too far into detail about that. What we do know is that a time arose when James Cameron was once again offered the chance to direct his version of Spider-Man. But James Cameron declined, as his desire to produce original content outweighed his love of Spider-Man. And I guess that's understandable. I know that there's a number of people that are kind of bummed out by the fact that this film never got made. James Cameron has proven to be a heck of a director, and to see his vision for Spider-Man play out could have been something really special. But I, for one, feel no regret, and I'll explain why. I think it's kind of evident that in many ways, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man drew a lot of inspiration from James Cameron's Spider-Man. This film clearly served as some kind of a blueprint for what Spider-Man 1 under Sony Pictures would go on to be. We've got the origins of Peter Parker, we've got Mary Jane dating Flash Thompson, we have puberty metaphors, albeit much more subtle. There's that sense of a forbidden blooming love interest in Mary Jane here, but it's clear that Sam Raimi went a different route to what James Cameron did, because rather than having Peter literally web up Mary Jane and go his own way on her, we do have a scene where Spider-Man rescues Mary Jane from muggers and does claim a reward for it, but instead it's that magical and iconic upside down kiss that we all know and love, with the rain billowing down on them representing, yeah, that liquid. Nice. There is also, of course, Spider-Man's ability to produce his own webs straight from his wrists, except this time the hand warts aren't as gross, so therefore he doesn't need web shooters to cover them up. Admittedly, I thought that was a decent little compromise in the James Cameron version. I mean, yeah, it would cause some kind of gross wart-like stuff around the wrists, so yeah, sure, why would he not cover them up with metal? The whole science project thing, being kind of the catalyst for Peter and Mary Jane, is fine in James Cameron's version, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Also, Mary Jane being kind of adulterous and a bit of an easy get for Spider-Man. Yep, that also ended up in the Sam Raimi movies. But she was definitely a much more difficult get for Peter Parker in the Sam Raimi movies, which I feel like it made a nicer distinction between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. I also love the fact that Peter Parker in the end of Spider-Man 1 turned her down. It's a much more somber ending than, well, pouring money on New York City and graduating to different colleges but having a long-distance relationship, like in the James Cameron version. As well as that, Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films is definitely a much better fit for a Spider-Man origin story and for this film than Carlton Strand and Boyd. Now, obviously, what we are reading of James Cameron's version of Spider-Man, who knows, this probably wasn't the final version of the script they'd ever go on to make. This probably wasn't the final version of the storyboards they'd ever go on to make. But it definitely appears in some fairly final stages. I mean, they wouldn't go on to do these storyboards if the script wasn't at all ready. The point I'm making, though, is that we got a Spider-Man film from a powerhouse director featuring organic web shooters, a forbidden love interest in Mary Jane, puberty metaphors, but minus the cursing, minus the killing, minus the Robin Hood-esque stealing from criminals, minus the graphic romance, with a properly developed villain that's pretty comic book accurate. Another fun tidbit is that James Cameron wanted to use early-stage CGI after the spider bite to represent hallucinations that Peter was having. We very much got that in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. So the reason I have no sense of regret that this film was never made is because, well, in many ways it was. We just got a far more refined version of this story in the end. Robin Hood-style antics, Spider-Man accidentally murdering people, and cursing have no place in a Spider-Man origin story. And had we gotten the James Cameron Spider-Man film, we would likely have never have seen the Sam Raimi Spider-Man film. And in any alternate timeline giving the power, that's just not a trade I'd be willing to make. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movie is the best version of this story. And I'm so grateful that we ended up with what we got in the end. The journey to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man was a very troubled one, very obviously. But I think the outcome was well worth it, and it definitely to a degree put Marvel Comics back on the map, after a long period of absolutely hemorrhaging money. And in many ways, you can't really deny this, the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man films wrote the playbook of what Marvel Studios would go on to begin the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like 'em or not, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films redefined what the comic book genre could be on film. They found a massive balance between creativity and paying tribute to what's come before, with glitzy Hollywood costumes that still looked immediately recognizable to what they were supposed to be from the comic books, with credible stories that still drew a lot of inspiration from their source material. Modern cinema at that time had never really done something like this before, and had it come out so refined, with such well fleshed out interpersonal character stories about the alter egos behind these masks. And this would only get better in the sequel, Spider-Man 2. So that was the birth of Spider-Man in Hollywood. What do you guys think? What Spider-Man films would you have loved to see that we talked about in these videos? Comment below and discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below are links to my Patreon and my Discord. Now stay tuned for some exciting promotions. Oh hey gang, look at this! Channel Goat is back! But he's got bad news. His computer was hacked by the Adzinko gang, and they leaked his private information. And now his goat cojones are there for everybody to see. Ah man, that's quite a predicament you got there, Channel Goat. And the thing is, you're not the only one. Do you know how many people get hacked per year and have their personal information and data spread online for all to see? A lot. Like, look it up. And I know what the rest of you are thinking. It hasn't happened to me, yet. Well, emphasis on yet. I mean, how old are you? Right, now how long is the average human lifespan? That's a lot of time that you could get hacked in. And by the time that's done, everybody is gonna know what your pee-pee looks like. Do you really want that? Do you really want the world to see your pee-pee? You run that risk every single day, guys. Seriously, hackers, pretty talented people. Which is why I, for one, use NordVPN to protect my private information and my Nords. It shuffles your data so that it can't be found by hackers, but not only that, it can also unlock the worldwide range of Netflix. And like, who wouldn't want that, right? Now you can really maximize your subscription. The fact is, guys, you could save yourself the stress and a lawsuit by simply browsing with NordVPN. And I've made it easy for you. A link is in the description below. And this subscription comes with a promise. Nobody has to know what you're into anymore. You little furry you. Anyway, sign up today. Seriously, do it. Please? For your sweet little puppy? This video is brought to you by Zentai for all your cosplay needs. Link is in the description below and they are very cool and good. Cosplay your favorite characters or send in one of your own designs. Affordable prices and very high quality. Made to order and made to measure. But most of all, made to be heckin' awesome. If you couldn't already tell. Guys, can you believe where we are now and where we started? How long ago it was that Channel Pup, or Channel Go even, came about? Because it really wasn't that long when you think about it. Can you believe the amount of support I've received from this community, from all of you subscribing to the channel and everything? It's unreal. It's a dream come true for me. But behind the YouTubers you watch usually comes a bit of a truth, is that they're often dirt poor. Now, I've had the good fortune of being able to grow this YouTube channel, and hopefully turn it into a career, but I'm gonna need a little bit of help along the way, to even the odds, to make ends meet, so that I can use all of the possible time that I have to make videos for you guys, as opposed to doing something mundane, for barely enough money to make it worth its while. I've done all that. I've lived that life. The fact is, together we all built Channel Pup. We made it what it is today, and I want to keep the ball rolling on that. I don't ever want to stop doing this, because this is the most gratifying job I've ever had, and I think the most pleasurable hobby anyone could ever have. I don't take any of the support that I receive from you guys for granted, but if in any way you're wondering if maybe you could do a little more for the channel even, then I want to direct you to the Patreon link in the description below. It would mean the world to me to have your support via Patreon. It can help me to make ends meet, it can help me to better my content, it can help me to have more time to really work on this stuff. But you know what, I'm not just gonna take your support and run. No way, Jose. In the Patreon, you can access exclusive videos via the Pups Project Room playlist, where you can see different projects that I've been working on or have worked on that have either not made it to YouTube for general viewing or have been cancelled, or, well, you can get a little view of the process that goes behind the Channel Pup videos and productions. As well as that, you tend to get advanced previews of the bigger Channel Pup projects, our tentpole event projects. If you've seen Marvelous Tales of Spider-Man, you'll be aware that that was released on the Patreon first, and 20 days later approximately was released for general viewing on YouTube. That's not the only time I'm gonna do this. But you know what? If you can't do the Patreon, or are just not interested in doing the Patreon, I fully understand. Like, it's still a big ask in my opinion. And what counts most is your support. So, as always, thank you so much, guys. I've been Channel Pup, and I will think of a better catchphrase next time. Now please leave me alone!